Ready when you are. I mean, we're waiting for some flag or something.
I think that's a wave. I think we're good to go. All right, all right. So welcome to this lecture. Today we will be talking about the physical layer. And I don't mean that we're going to be talking about breaking down doors and picking locks. I mean the physical layer of radio. We're going to show you some nifty tricks that you can do at the Phi layer, many of which were previously believed to be impossible. We're going to be showing you how an attacker who only controls layer 7 data can inject a layer 1 packet without having a radio. You can email a Wi-Fi beacon, and this works. We will also be showing you ways of fingerprinting radios by behavioral differences. I will be apologizing to Sergey for calling fingerprinting boring, because it turns out that you can get weaponized attacks out of it.
And generally, Phi is considered something of a black box, right? Something that belongs in engineering rather than computer science. So there is this mystery hanging over it. And we're going to show that there is no mystery, that it's built of simple mechanisms layered on top of each other. So there are many layers to the Phi. And we're going to try for demystifying it, pardon the pun. So, and then we're going to talk about dialects of Phi. So whenever you talk about dialects, you have this image of the Tower of Babel and the diversion of languages. Well, here's another image also dealing with Babylon. So think of this beast with many heads as the beast of Phi.
Now, all of these heads are ugly, but they're ugly in slightly different ways.
So here's how this started. We were having a discussion at Recon one night, and I was trying to convince Travis to do link layer fingerprinting.
And I said fingerprinting is boring.
And then we had some more discussion. And then somehow I managed to convince Travis that, no, it's not boring, it's worth trying at least. And so it went from there. And then it really got us quite a bit of ponage, and it got Travis the pony. And so what brought me to that boat was Wright's principle, which I actually helped phrase after I heard it in Joshua Wright's TourCon talk about Killer Bee, the tool to exercise the 8215.4 Zigbee Phi. And Wright's principle reads, security won't get better until tools for practical exploration of the attack surface are made available. What does that mean? We need to be able to inject raw frames. We need to be able to inject raw frames with ease, such as, say, with Python. So we went ahead and wrote, in addition to Killer Bee, the Scapy Python .15d4 library that allowed you to stuff all the fields of that frame as you see them. And of course, if you looked at the standard, it actually looks like this. And then if you look at the interdependence of those fields, it looks more like this. So of course you want some help with generation of those frames. But you want to generate them with a few lines of Python, and now you can. So then, of course, we need to play with that particular Phi, so we need radios. A bunch of those radios exist. There is a specialized development from Atmel called RZ-USB stick. There is a variant of the Arduino called the Frigduino Chibi. There is a packet analyzer, a sniffer, a bunch of them. And around our lab, we had a whole bunch of T-modes, Telos B T-modes, which are, again, a chip and a microcontroller on the same PCB. I actually planned to go into software-defined radios as well, but this is where Travis said, no, we're not going to do that. Not every neighbor can afford $1,500 for a software-defined radio.
So at the time that we began this, there were no cheap software-defined radios. Now there are, but there's still good reason to avoid them in this style of research, because you want your attacks in the end to work by pure software on the normal hardware that speaks these protocols. If you have a software-defined radio, then you're implementing everything from scratch, and you rely on a situation in which all of that custom hardware and custom software is available. What you'd much rather have is a single packet that can run over an ordinary network using the existing radio, rather than having to introduce your own.
Yeah, basically, you want your own device for injecting raw frames to be something that you can, bring around, and if it goes bad, then hey, you can just take another one. So by the end of it, we actually built our own, which we called AP mode beta, and in retrospect, the pun is not very visible. You see the little B there? That's from the Latin apis, the bee. Well, yes, Zigbee, killer bee, that sort of thing. No one gets it, neither do I. Whatever possessed us to call it that. But here you go. This is the AP mode. The microcontroller in the center is an MSP430, Travis's favorite chip. The chip on the right, sitting in this little square, is the Chipcon 2420. Again, our favorite chip for Zigbee. And of course, it's sitting in the middle of some radio components, which turned out to be quite tricky to debug. Otherwise, this is what you would know as a good FET. And so you can see the FTDI chip to the left.
So this is the sort of radio that you would find in an electronic thermostat or an electronic weather monitor. These are used in home security systems, in smart electric meters. So the same principles that you discover when researching with this hardware can be ported to run inside of that other hardware. You can take an attack that you write for the AP mode, and you can rewrite it to run inside of a thermostat. This can transmit packets that the thermostat will receive, or that a home security system will receive. This can implement the same cryptography that those devices support in hardware. So whatever you develop on this custom research hardware can be directly ported to run on scavenged hardware, or hardware that already exists within your target environment.
Because most likely they will be using this or similar chip. So the reason we're describing this is that I have some of those for you to take home if you're interested in Zigbee. And it's more or less a standard good FET with a radio front end. So Chipcon 2420, you can talk to it over USB, you can talk to it in Python, and there are some options for powering it from a battery if you care. And also, there are many places that you would find Zigbee. If you take one of those cards and use our ZB scan software to sniff, you would probably see building monitoring, building energy control systems. Zigbee is also quite popular in manufacturing automation. So if there is a factory nearby, maybe you can talk to the robots. So this is the stuff that we're going to play with. And then, of course, the question is, what is that Phi, right? And what is Phi in general, right? So somewhere there exists a wave, this electromagnetic oscillation in the air, and somehow it becomes a packet. Actually, my wife asked me quite a long time ago, well, how does it know where the packet starts and ends? And I mumbled something scientific, and she was right. I did not understand how the heck it works. So, magic happens, right? A good fairy waves her wand, and suddenly you get a frame, with those fields frame control data sequence, MAC addresses, and such like. So this is the level of understanding of Phi that we have. It's sort of the business plan, right? You know, somehow one thing becomes the other. And, well, this is the magic of abstraction, which is what I must have mumbled back then. But in reality, you know, in order to get all of those tasty little fields, you know, you have to decide that you're actually in the frame. There is always noise. Noise is typically indistinguishable from a weak signal, right? And so the magic has to work twice. First, you need to know that you're in the frame, and then you need to know that the frame ends, right? Yeah, and then things turn to pumpkins and all the other.
If you could jump back one slide. So the thing to notice here is that you as a user of this network, you just want the packet. But as an attacker against this networking protocol, you need to understand every piece of the packet, including the ones that aren't normally shown to the operating system. These yellow parts, the beginning and the end, this noise that surrounds the packet, exists because this packet comes through a radio channel that has background static. And the beginning of the packet, where you see the frame check and that sort of stuff, the exact point at which the arrow is, there's actually a couple of bits there that exist to mark where the packet begins. And this gets stripped off before the packet is sent up to the operating system. You can place these same bits inside of your message. And when you do that, all sorts of strange things happen, because the receiving radio isn't quite sure at which of multiple points the packet began.
Well, so, you know, what the Phi layer is really a collection of various simple mechanisms, such as that, those that provide that magic. So this is what the frame actually looks like. So we're going to guide you through a succession of lies. You know, there is this profession, liar to children, otherwise known as teacher. So we're going to guide you through a collection of fairy tales, which have their uses. And this is the first one of them, right? So there are symbols. Your magical chip somehow knows how to extract symbols out of the air. And then your frame starts with 8 symbols of 0. And then there is a sync field, which starts the frame. And this field is not shown to your operating system or your Wireshark. Then, following that sync field, which is 2 symbols, is the length, which is, again, 2 symbols. And that's how long the packet is. And so what follows next is what you actually see as the body of the frame.
So each of these symbols is 4 bits wide. So wherever you see a byte, the byte is a pair of 2 symbols. The preamble is 0 repeated, which would normally be a bad choice, but it works out here for a reason we'll get to later, which is that each of these symbols that represents 4 bits, beneath the hood is actually 32 ones and zeros long. They're not really the same thing as bits, because not all combinations of the 32 are valid. These are used to only represent the 16 combinations of 4 bits.
And you know, it's very easy to see bytes here, but in fact they're not there. All of those boundaries between bytes and actually between symbols even exist entirely in your head. And this is the sort of free your mind kind of exercise. Stop seeing those boundaries.
So if you understand what's beneath the symbol, you can create different symbol combinations that mean the same thing.
Then, of course, in physical reality, right, the chip gets those symbols out of the air and then sends them over some communication channel, such as a serial bus, to a microcontroller, which then does something with it. say, decodes a frame or passes it on to the OS. So this is the part of the standard where they talk about the preamble, the start of frame delimiter, and the frame length, the shaded region, right? But again, we are talking about fields and all of those boundaries that you see, all of those neat vertical lines. But let's ask ourselves, why? I mean, say, why the preamble, right? What is it even? What is it for? And forget the actual bytes, right? Forget the actual symbols. They're somehow encoded, modulated, and extracted. But can we even agree on time between the receiver and the transmitter? Because, you know, all of those things are ultimately sine waves modulated one way or another. You know, if all you have is radio, then sine wave is your hammer and nail and everything else. And you just twist it a little bit here and there, and so you transmit your information. But clocks drift, right? And the actual, at the resolution that you need to parse those sine waves, your clocks drift between different devices significantly, even within a frame.
And we're not talking about like speed of light, quantum theory, clock drift. This happens for much simpler reasons. The quartz crystals that are used to provide the clock in these chips, there are manufacturing differences between them. So some are a little bit faster and a little bit slower. When the circuit gets hotter, the oscillators begin to oscillate faster. So it believes that time is going faster than it actually is. And when the device gets cold, the opposite happens, and it begins to slow down a little bit. And these differences are enough that the two radios can't naturally agree on where one symbol ends and the next begins. So what they do instead is they send a repeating pattern from the transmitter to the receiver, and this is called the preamble. And the only purpose of this pattern is to share the transmitter's clock with the receiver. The receiver then has a mechanism called a phased locked loop, or a PLL. And this phased locked loop will copy the clock of the transmitter into the receiver so that for the remainder of the message, the receiver is using the clock of the transmitter instead of its own clock.
And so then the question is, how many of these symbols, repeated symbols, are actually enough to synchronize? So the standard says 8. But in fact, the chip has a register where you can set the preamble length and control how many of those you would actually send. And that could be from anywhere from none to 8. And of course, depending on temperature, the amount of the preamble needed is varying. But what if you vary it purposefully? And here, you already start seeing interesting things. So look at this graph. We're sending beacon requests and getting beacon responses from the target. And the targets are a T-mode, a Zigduino, and RZ USB stick. So a chipcon versus an Atmel variation for those. And you see, when you send 0 preamble, T-mode sometimes hears this packet and answers. If you start with 2 symbols, T-mode, the chip, answers always, no matter how many you send, so long as you send 2. Then the RZSB stick is actually the pickiest. It starts receiving only when you start with 6 or 7. So already you have fingerprinting behavior of the receiver. And think of what it might do, right? You can send a packet that is heard by some, but not others. And this has nothing to do with signal strength. Isn't that interesting?
So you can transmit a packet that the thermostat will interpret, but a wireless intrusion detection system or a packet sniffer based upon a different brand of the radio chip would not detect.
So isn't that interesting? But we'll come to that later. So then comes the start of frame delimiter, right? Why is that? So we know about the preamble now. The sync is this magical value, A7, and the machinery in the chip is a shift register that matches those two symbols from the continual stream that is being pulled out of the air. So when you lock on and you receive A7, that's when you start accumulating bytes and checksumming them. And then when you have received so many of them as the length tells you, then you check the checksum and you throw that byte away, that frame away, if it doesn't fit. Or you pass it up if it does fit. So
before the A7, when you're in the preamble, as far as the radio is concerned, there is no packet yet. The radio takes whatever comes in and feeds that into the phase-locked loop to adjust the clock, but it's not actually reading those bytes or those symbols as bytes and symbols. It just sort of naturally passes them through to get a feel for the timing of whomever might be transmitting. It's at the moment that the sync field arrives, which is also called the SFD, or the start of frame delimiter. At that moment, the receiver begins to treat the incoming data as a packet. It no longer recalibrates its clock, and it begins collecting the bytes that come after into a buffer to send to the host operating system.
And so then, of course, the next question arises. What if the start of frame delimiter is in the symbol set, right? Those symbols that are being pulled out of the air, are they the same for the payload and for the SFD? And it varies by protocol. For 802.15.4, the answer is yes. For 802.11b, the answer is also yes for the older versions of the protocol. For G, the answer is kind of. That is unfortunate. But G is such a mess, backward compatible mess with B that you can't possibly make much sense of it. So for a whole bunch of other protocols, this is a different symbol, which never occurs in the payload. So the trick that we're going to show you next would not work for those protocols. And those protocols include PCI Express, the packet radio, and everyone's favorite, the Ethernet. But in case you think that you can't mess with the Phi of the internet, Andrea Barisani and Daniela Bianco have proven you wrong. They've built a card that allows you to inject arbitrary payloads for Phi into Ethernet.
So Sergey and I came up with an attack called packet in packet. The idea behind packet in packet is that in many protocols, you can include the start of frame delimiter inside of a message. Also, in many networking protocols, an attacker will be given control of layer 7 data, but he wants layer 1 data. So, for example, you might be able to control a cat picture that's on a website at layer 7, but what you really want to do is to inject your own raw traffic at layer 1 to spoof a message from another host or to do other nasty things.
And then you look at this simple mechanism for matching the frame, and you ask yourself, what happens if this A7 turns into a pumpkin, gets damaged by noise, and is not heard by the receiver? then the sequence of symbols will continue. And the receiver will actually just go on receiving the preamble that's actually in the payload, and then receiving the sync. That's when it says, ah, this must be a frame. So you can't really tell the payload symbols from the SFD symbols. And you can embed, a full frame just like that and hope that noise is going to kill that SFD. And you know what? There is always noise.
Wait on that example. So the cool thing about this packet, if you look at all of these bytes, this packet has two different valid starting locations. This packet either begins at the A7 that's at the beginning, or it begins at the A7 that's in the middle. And when you have a wireless network, particularly at 2.4 gigahertz, you have packets colliding with each other. My cell phone uses both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on the same band. It will happily transmit a Bluetooth packet while someone else is trying to speak Wi-Fi. And it will happily transmit a Wi-Fi packet when someone else is trying to use Bluetooth. So when that happens, the beginning or the end of the packet gets destroyed. If the end of the packet gets destroyed, it's no big deal, because the checksum is wrong and the packet will be dropped. But if the beginning of the packet is damaged, if that first A7 becomes anything else, becomes A6 or B7, then the receiver skips over all of the header data, thinking that it's garbage, just background noise, until it finds the interior A7, which it recognizes as being a valid packet. And then it reads the bytes after it, which it treats as a packet. And it reads the last of those bytes as a checksum, which is the correct checksum. And it forwards that packet all the way up the host to a host operating system that has no way to know that this packet is not real.
So the boundaries of the frame that you see in the nice diagrams, they are entirely imaginary. And you imagine them to be there, but the reality will turn around and bite you. Remember the Phi beast, right? It has many ways to bite you. But you see, you can send a Phi frame without a radio, and that's the first of the fairy tales, surprising fairy tales of Phi. And noise is always there. So we were seeing one of those packets in 600 or 800. And we wrote a paper about this. And this is, old. This is a pony. Travis presented it at Wood. And that was interesting because no one noticed. It's like, here is a huge break in the protocol. And that protocol is presumably valuable. And, so we had to go and spread the word elsewhere.
So a bit later, there was a follow-up paper that a student wrote. I believe he was from Canada. And he decided that he could make a defense for packet-in-packet. Because, as I showed you earlier, I'm injecting the packet by placing A7 inside of the message. He thought that he could just escape that. So wherever you see A7, instead have some 2-byte pattern. And if a 2-byte pattern needs to be there legitimately, you can escape that with a different 2-byte pattern.
So it's kind of like PHP magic, right? And inserting escaping symbols and extra quotes. Guess how well that works? So that doesn't work, actually. And the reason why it doesn't work is that the boundaries between symbols are also imaginary. So here's the first lie revealed. Symbols are, in fact, not ones and zeros, right? They are not bits. They are sequences of chips.
So when, in the previous slides, we showed you a 1 or a 2 or a 7 or an F, they were actually these long sequences. So when we told you that the preamble pattern consisted of 8 zeros, it actually consists of 8 copies of 110, 110, 0, 111, and so on. And if you look at these chips line up to each other. The reason why they have so many of these is that when there are small errors on the radio can look for the nearest match. So if you damage up to 7 of the bits in this sequence, the closest symbol by Hamming distance will always be the correct one.
So, and then you can ask yourself, well, what's below that? You know, what are those ones and zeros? And yes, those ones and zeros will be pieces of the sine wave.
So if you look at these numbers and you ask where they came from, the official standard document will tell you that they are random. But they're not. What they actually are 2 different random numbers that were left shifted. So if you take 0 and you take the 4 bits from the far right and you move them to the left, you get a 1. And if you repeat this, you get a 2. And if you repeat that, you get a 3. This goes all the way up to 7, and then 7 goes back to 0. The same thing happens with 8 to F. So if you left shift or right shift these little shifts, then you get a different message. All of your symbols go off by 1. This is a bit easier to see in hexadecimal. The E goes to the left to make a 0 into a 1. Then the 2 goes to the left to make a 1 into a 2. And if you look vertically, you see that the same nibble is repeated. So what this means is that we can take a message that does not use any blacklisted bytes, and we can make that message become the message that we really want to send when it is shifted by 1/8 of a symbol in time.
So remember those sequences of symbols that we put on the slides? Those don't exist. Instead, you're dealing with these chips in hexadecimal notation. Well, then, of course, the question is, how do you know when a chip code starts? And the answer is that you don't.
So in our original attack, we used the sequence that was a bunch of zeros followed by A7. What we found out is that you can also have a packet that begins with a bunch of 1s followed by B0. And that over the air, this will automatically be corrected by the receiver to become the zeros in the A7. But the firewall software that was written as a defense against this attack will never notice it, because the actual translation happens as the packet is going over the air.
So notice that this scheme is possible because the starter frame delimiter is matched after the chips are in. So you have this weird interplay between the layers, and as a result, you can send a frame and receive a frame that shares no symbol with the send frame. Think about this, right? You think of the Phi layer as something that, well, you send this thing, and either it's damaged by noise and not received, or it is received exactly as transmitted. Turns out that you can actually receive a frame that had no symbol in common with the frame that was sent. Isn't that interesting?
So we're going to step back for a moment and review chip modulation. And then we're going to show you some really cool tricks that you can do by modulating one style with a different one. So when you have your symbol itself that you want to put out on the radio, you would traditionally either use AM or FM. In AM, you change the signal strength of the transmitter. So you pump more power into the transmitter when the volume is higher. And you reduce the strength in order to make it lower, and this reproduces the sound on the receiver. There's also FM, and FM works by keeping the same strength coming out of the transmitter and varying ever so slightly the frequency of the transmitter in order to share the volume of the original signal.
Yeah, remember, if you're a radio engineer, then your world basically consists of sine waves. So all you can do is do something to them. You can change the amplitude, you can change the frequency, or you can change the phase. And 8215.4 actually uses a shifted phase, but other protocols use modulations of AM and FM.
So the simplest style of modulation is on-off keying. This is also called CW modulation, or Morse code. So the photograph here is from a beacon that is in the city of Philadelphia in the United States. And it begins with a short burst and two long bursts, which is di-da-da, which is W. And then it has di-di-di-da-da, which is a 3. And then there's da-di-da-di, which is a C. And the entire message can be spelled out this way. Someone who is skilled in using Morse code can understand this transmitter from the audio without having to write anything down. So you can do the same thing with packets over Wi-Fi. So if you have a quiet Wi-Fi channel and you've man-in-the-middled an SSL encrypted session, you can't really change any of the data inside the SSL connection, unless you have a bug, as frequently you do. But if you don't have a bug, one of the things that you are still allowed to do is to change the time at which the packet arrives. Because packets get delayed on the internet all the time, it's not really suspicious for one to come a bit sooner or a bit later. So what you can do is you can cluster up all of the packets and send them at times to produce a Morse code message. And then you can listen for that Morse code message coming out of the transmitter. So then, even when you have another layer of encryption, let's say that there's encrypted Wi-Fi, this still works. And then you can drive around the town listening for the Morse code signal in order to figure out which wireless network in that city is accessing the web server that you control, knowing nothing else along the route.
Which is to say, you don't need to use the native hardware to speak Morse code. You can use Wi-Fi hardware to speak Morse code. So the funny thing about modulations is that they nest, and then with many of them you can modulate, they can emulate another, and isn't that fun? So the same is true with frequency shift keying.
So frequency shift keying is sort of like the FM equivalent of Morse code, if Morse code is AM. In frequency shift keying, you have a couple of very closely spaced frequencies. Let's say that you have 2 of them. The higher frequency will be a 1, the lower frequency will be a 0. So if we wanted to send the, say we wanted to send 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, we just send the low frequency wherever we have a 0, and we send the high frequency wherever we have a 1. So one of the things that we found was that there's a ghosting effect. If you have an FSK radio tuned to channel 8, transmitting, and you have a receiver on channel 7, you see the original message with all of the bits flipped. Because the receiver on channel 7 is only looking at the signal strength on its 2 channels, on its 2 little sample points. And the higher frequency for channel 7 is the lower frequency for channel 8. So all the bits come in flipped. The same thing would happen if you received on channel 9, which means that wherever a particular sequence is blacklisted in FSK, you can just invert all of the bits and transmit on the wrong channel and allow the receiver to flip them again to become what they used to be.
So you see, you hear ghost voices. Remember how LPs and then cassette tapes were supposed to contain some satanic message if you play them back, back to front? Well, this is sort of like it. But this just shows how frequency shift keying actually works. And then, of course, there is the phase shift keying, which means that the pieces of the sine wave do not change frequency. It's the same frequency, but you receive those pieces shifted in phase. So, you know, now it's a sine, and now it's a cosine. And you can have 2 phases or 4 phases, or you can actually have a combination of amplitude and phase. Those are interesting modulation schemes. Long story short, 802.15.4 uses QPSK with 4 phases.
So when earlier we showed you those sequences of 32 ones and zeros, that was also sort of a lie. Those bits come in pairs, and each pair of them gets transmitted at a time as part of a subsymbol. So there are multiple intermediate layers at which you can think of a packet and do crazy things to the packet. And whichever layer of abstraction you choose, it's going to be a little bit wrong in one way or another. You can always go a bit lower.
So the protocol beast, it has many heads. It might be a song, right? The protocol beast, it has many heads.
On the magic school bus.
He does it to me every time, you know. Every time I presumably carry a tune, I carry like one and the same tune. I don't know.
He says that it's a Soviet children's song, but
God knows what it is. Anyway, so Phi harbors many surprises. And a 0 is a 0, and a 1 is a 1, except when they aren't. So, now that we can vary our transmissions along all those lines, you ask yourself a question. Do radios have dialects? And we already saw that with the variable preamble, but now we have the machine for exploring that question. And that machine is the AAP mode. And the ChipCon 2420 chip has a register where you can set the S of D to something else. Apparently, the manufacturers wanted to accommodate proprietary networks, which are sort of following the standard, but not really. And that includes preambles. Now, if we set the S of D on the transmitter to something which is not A7, then by sending packets with our packet-in-packet payloads, we can get them through every time, because the receiver, of course, would be looking for the real S of D, not the bad value that we're using. And we choose that value to be far away as possible from the A7. So now we can send any number of symbols in preamble, anything between the preamble and the S of D, and anything for S of D, and so on and so forth. And we did active fingerprinting of 802.15.4 chips by sending them a beacon request, so mudged, and we got back. If we got back a beacon response, then we knew that we spoke a compatible dialect. And if we consistently didn't get back a beacon response, then apparently that was not the case. So what does this tell you, really? It's a WIDS evasion. It's an evasion of a wireless intrusion detection system. Unless the wireless intrusion detection system has all the chips and hears all the dialects. Isn't that interesting? And so we come to this. You know, fingerprinting. Everyone has been fingerprinting senders before. And I don't really like that, because that sort of attribution kind of thing is, well, you know, why do I want to do that? It's interesting, but not very. So, and then you have the trivial statement that all radio chips are different. And in fact, people have fingerprinted specific chips with expensive radios due to slight differences in their manufacture. So you can tell what sender is sending by small variations in modulation and in other parts of the signal. But that's sort of Captain Obvious, right? Except when we're thinking about what to call our fingerprinter, which fingerprinted receivers, we came up with this analog, right? So there are isotopes. Some atoms have a bit more neutrons than others. And that doesn't make it a different element. It's still, you know, whatever it is, well, except uranium has this interesting difference between the isotopes 238 and 235. And this difference is called the chain reaction, colloquially known as a nuke, right? As a nuclear bomb. So we decided to call our fingerprinting code isotope, with the subtle hint to this fact, just how small differences can be actually very important. And so here are three methods that we used. The one we called a Cumberland Gap. That's a part of Travis's native geography.
The Cumberland Gap historically is the break in the Appalachian mountain range that settlers would come through when fleeing the oppression of North Carolina. In our case, we took the preamble that, as you recall, is supposed to be all zeros, and we preceded it with a bunch of Fs in order to slightly break the standard. This breaks the standard in a way that many receiving radios will still allow through.
And if you're wondering what the whiskey has to do with it, the song goes,
drink a little whiskey, take a little nap. It's 15 miles to the Cumberland Gap. There's also the Franconia Notch.
Well, this is a part of my native geography. Well, as native as I am to New Hampshire. We're sort of like Team Appalachia, right? Southern Appalachia, Northern Appalachia. Yay. So, in fact, you can walk the Appalachian Trail from his mountains to my mountains. And it's this one big unbroken trail. If the bears don't get here. So, Franconia Notch is another feature of, our mountains. So here, the same trick is applied differently. We use a variable size of preamble and replace the remaining zeros in the preamble with Fs. So we are breaking the preamble ever so slightly, and then we send the real SFD. So will the preamble be enough to synchronize in the presence of this little abridging garbage between that separates the preamble and the SFD? And we have two different kinds of that bridging. One bridging is when we replace the zeros of the preamble with Fs. And the other variant is when we take the full preamble and then insert a few Fs between the preamble and the SFD. And you know what? It works. So packets are still heard despite the Fs being there as this little bridge where it shouldn't be. There shouldn't be a bridge.
So those Fs sort of slightly knock the clock out of skew, but depending upon how the clock is designed, it might be resilient enough to ignore them.
Yeah, so we go through a bunch of stimuli packets that we sent, just like this, sometimes consuming the entire preamble. And what do we see? So here is a chipcon in our AP mode, and here is the Atmel chip in the RZ USB stick. And if you send the preamble with 2 zeros replaced by Fs, RZ USB hears all of those, whereas chipcon hears none.
So this allows you to create a shaped charge, a packet that will only be heard by one brand of receiver, in order to allow your attack to hit your intended target, but evade any wireless intrusion detection system or any packet sniffer that might be nearby using a different chipset.
So isn't that interesting? And then the same thing in Wireshark basically confirms Well, not on Wireshark, as it were. This is this is a different sniffer. You see the preambles getting through on one chip and never getting through when munged on the other chip. Again, here we go. You know, a clean slate heard on one, and all of the interesting ones heard on another. So you can experiment with that, and you can build your own dialects. So this is weaponizing those receiver characteristics, weaponizing the receiver dialects. Isn't that interesting? So there is ponage in Phi. Phi is not monolithic. Phi is not a black box. Phi can be had in many ways, and in fact, you should never really trust your particular implementation of Phi, because there are so many ways to get around it. And obviously, the bypasses are on every layer. All these symbol boundaries, all the byte boundaries that you see in the standards are imaginary. And you can actually shift those boundaries if you play with the signal. And also, you sort of have this, you're trained to expect magic. You're trained to expect that the complex packet with all of those different fields and all of their subtle relationships, right? All of that is supposed to come from the wireless interface intact. But no, you know, those are really simple machines. They don't do validation. They're parsers. As parsers go, these are easily fooled because they're very simple parsers. They know nothing of sender's intent. So we call on you to continue this kind of research. And I remind you that layers of abstraction become boundaries of competence. And we should not allow them to become so.
Yeah, just as in software, when the Java developer who doesn't pay attention to the functioning of the C libraries beneath his code creates accidental vulnerabilities, or when the PHP developer who doesn't understand the interaction between his PHP script and his SQL server creates vulnerabilities. The same thing happens inside of a microchip, as the layer 2 designer does not quite understand what's going on at layer 1. Whereas the layer 1 designer doesn't quite understand what's going on at layer 0 or -1 or -2, or each of the layers as these go down.
And so we find ourselves in Babylon. And now you've met the beast of Phi. And it might become your friend.
Thank you kindly.
Enjoy Babylon.